what would be 3 foods that you would recommend everyone eliminate? If you could eliminate or have very, very little every once in a while, but if you could almost eliminate these 3 foods from your diet, it would help you in a big way.
But obviously sugar. Sugar in the quantity, refined sugar in the quantities we eat is absolutely toxic to the body. Number 2 would be processed fats. So healthy fats are natural fats, butter, meat fat, pork, avocado, olive oil, etc. Because we don't change them, we don't mess with them. But anything that we make an oil from that doesn't come easily, like a seed or corn. Corn has just a couple of % fat in it, so it takes a lot of heat and chemicals and processing to get any oil out of it. So it tastes terrible. And then you have to bleach it and deodorize it and all that. So it's not a food anymore. And those foods are extremely toxic. So soybean oil, corn oil, canola oil, all of those processed oils, and especially if they're turned into a food product like margarine or shortening or something like that.
Okay.
And then something, again, that's not really a food, but I would put it up there. And every time I make a video on this, I get a lot of backlash, and it's artificial sweeteners.
Oh, man. Why are artificial sweeteners
and people
not good for us?
Because they are chemicals. They're foreign substances. They were developed by companies who made pesticides. And the latest and greatest, so aspartame got a bad rap, so then they had to hustle to come up with something else, so they came up with sucralose. And they were very careful to name it in a way that like sounded, sugar. Yes, sucrose, sugar, sucralose. And then they said that, well, you know, it's just like sugar, and then it just has some chlorine, just like sea salt. Well, in nature, sodium chloride is only bonded through like an electrostatic charge. I forget exactly what it's called, but it's not like a tight bond. So yes, sodium chloride, perfectly natural. But when we bind chlorine to a carbon, nature never does that. Basically, every form of a chlorocarbon is a pesticide. And one of the most famous ones was DDT, which was banned as a cancer-causing agent. It almost wiped out the national bird, the eagle. And it's so toxic, it's in our environment 50 years later. So chlorocarbons are pesticides, and that's what sucralose is. It's a chlorocarbon.
Wow.
인공감미료에 대해서는 전문가들 사이에서도 의견이 갈립니다. 이 인터뷰에서 뿐만 아니라 다른 여러 영상에서도 에크버그 박사는 화학적인 제조 과정을 통해 만들어진 인공감미료에 대해 강한 거부감을 드러냈는데요. 사실 수크랄로스는 1976년 영국에서 살충제를 개발하던 중 실수로 발견된 것이 맞습니다. 한 지도교수가 개발 중인 살충제 화합물을 테스트하라는 말을 인도 출신의 연구원이 테이스트로 잘못 알아듣고 맛보았다가 강한 단맛을 느꼈고 그렇게 수크랄로스가 탄생했습니다. 하지만 제초제와 수크랄로스는 전혀 다른 물질입니다. 따라서 에크버그 박사의 발언은 잠재적인 위험성을 경계하는 것이지 그것이 제초제만큼 위험하다는 뜻은 아닙니다. 그의 생각은 이런 겁니다. 가공식품에 사용되는 여러 감미료는 대부분의 국가와 주요기관에서 사용을 승인했지만 그것이 안전성에 대한 검증이 완전히 끝났다는 걸 의미하지는 않습니다. 위험성에 대해서도 마찬가지입니다. 수크랄로스는 면역체계나 장내 미생물에 영향을 줄 수도 있다는 연구 결과도 있지만 그 위해성이 100% 명백하게 밝혀진 것은 아닙니다. 그렇다면 위험성이 완벽하게 입증되기 전까지는 맘 놓고 먹어도 될까요? 아니면 안전성을 확신할 수 있을 만한 연구 결과가 나올 때까지 최대한 피하는 게 좋을까요? 저는 굳이 제 몸을 실험 대상으로 삼고 싶지 않고 에크버그 박사도 그렇게 생각하는 것 같습니다. 그리고 무엇보다 중요한 건 섭취량일 텐데요. 사람들은 음식의 종류에만 집중하고 섭취량에 대해서는 대부분 간과하는 것 같습니다. 높은 위험성을 가진 음식을 아주 가끔 먹는 것, 그리고 약간의 위험성을 가진 식품을 습관적으로 왕창 먹는 것 중에 뭐가 더 나쁠까요? 건강에 좋다는 음식조차도 필요 이상으로 먹으면 오히려 우리 몸에 악영향을 줄 수 있습니다. 따라서 저는 섭취량만 잘 조절할 수만 있다면 어떤 음식도 끊을 필요가 없다고 생각합니다. 그럼 음식의 섭취량에 관한 문제, 그리고 더 안전한 설탕 대체품에 대한 에크버그 박사의 의견을 더 들어보겠습니다.
So eliminate refined sugar, eliminate processed fats, which is mostly seed oils, and artificial sweeteners. Are
Yeah.
there any non-sugar sweeteners,
Yes.
natural,
Yes.
that you like or recommend that in the right doses are okay for you?
Yes. So I use quite a bit of stevia.
That's not an artificial sweetener, or it is?
No. So some people bundle it together with artificial sweeteners just because it's a non-calorie sweetener. But it is a plant product. It's just a refined leaf, basically. And the thing to watch for, though, is that they don't mix it up with a lot of other chemicals, that it's the concentrated version.
It's one ingredient, not
Correct.
10 ingredients.
Yeah. And another similar one would be monk fruit. That is also very similar in the way it tastes and looks and so forth. It's super, super concentrated. And it's also a plant extract.
So if you're going to add something to a coffee or a drink or something,
Correct.
stevia, monk fruit,
Yeah.
you say is okay in the right doses.
Yes.
Okay.
And then in the gray zone, I would also put sugar alcohols,
Interesting.
right?
Okay.
Some of them are better than others. I think the best one would be erythritol because it is very slightly metabolized by the body, so it doesn't really affect blood sugar, but it doesn't really cause any other problems. Some of the other sugar alcohols, they sort of stay in the digestive tract for a while, and then those sugar alcohols become food for your intestinal bacteria, and that's where you get a lot of bloating.
Gotcha.
So I would say sugar alcohols are okay if you eat them in moderation. So this is always the trick in recommending food. When you make a list and people want to know the best one and so forth, and you categorize it and rank them, and now they say, that is a good one, I'm just going to eat that. Or Dr. Eckberg said sugar alcohols are okay, so now I'm going to eat that every day. I'm going to bake with it, I'm going to buy the ice cream with it, and that's the thing, everything in moderation. So sugar alcohols, if you eat a teaspoon or a tablespoon here and there, I think it's totally fine. But if you start baking with it and doing the ice cream and you start getting half a cup a day, now you're definitely going to upset the biome a little bit.
Now, what matters based on your age range? You know, if someone's in their 20s versus I'm in my late 30s, almost 40, you're in your, I believe, 50s, you said.
Yeah.
Does it matter based on how old you are, of what you should be eating, how much you should be eating, the types of foods, or is it pretty consistent throughout the decades?
I would say it's pretty consistent throughout. And one analogy would be that, I mean, there's so many people, they say that women should fast this way and teenagers should fast this way and women over 40 or under 47. It's like we love to complicate things, right? But are there different foods on the savannah for one giraffe versus another?
An older giraffe and a younger giraffe.
Does the male and the female giraffe eat from different trees? It's like, not really. So I'm not saying that there's no value to that, but I think we tend to overcomplicate things. I think if we just understand that it's like 99% the same, and then that last percent is where if we want to really pick it apart, then there may be some benefit there.
키토제닉 식단에 반대하는 분들은 개개인의 체질을 문제 삼는 경우가 많습니다. 예를 들면 이런 것이죠. 저는 고기를 먹으면 속이 늘 불편해요. 한국인이라면 밥을 먹어줘야죠. 일주일 정도 해봤는데 저와는 잘 안 맞는 것 같아요. 네, 맞습니다. 식단뿐만 아니라 무엇이든 새롭게 시도할 때는 개인의 특성을 고려해야 합니다. 하지만 저는 개인의 체질과 특성을 지나치게 강조하다 보면 오히려 새로운 시도를 어렵게 만들 때도 있는 것 같습니다. 많은 경우 새롭게 시작한 식단을 할 때 느끼는 불편함이나 부작용은 체질의 문제보다는 적응하는 과정에서 일어나는 자연스러운 현상일 가능성이 높습니다. 이 영상은 이탈리아 사람들이 피자를 먹는 모습을 촬영한 것입니다. 1인당 거대한 피자를 한 판씩 앞에 두고 먹고 있네요. 그리고 이것은 한 방송에서 나온 미국의 스테이크 1인분 양이라고 합니다. 그리고 이렇게 한국인은 세계적으로 마늘을 많이 먹기로 유명합니다. 이것들은 무엇을 의미할까요? 이탈리아 사람들은 피자를 많이 먹을 수 있는 유전자를 가지고 있는 걸까요? 미국 사람들은 모두 고기를 잘 먹는 체질을 타고난 걸까요? 한국인은 유전적으로 마늘의 맛과 냄새에 둔감한 걸까요? 그렇지 않습니다. 이들은 오랜 시간 동안 그들의 식습관에 적응해 왔을 뿐입니다. 키토 식단도 이와 마찬가지로 우리 몸이 그동안 익숙해져 있던 탄수화물 중심의 식단에서 지방 중심의 식단으로 전환하는 과정에서는 적응이 필요합니다. 수십 년 동안 탄수화물을 주식으로 먹어왔는데 하루아침에 버터와 고기만 먹는 식단으로 바꾸려 한다면 몸이 바로 적응하지 못하는 것이 오히려 당연한 일이죠. 그래서 초반에 겪는 피로감이나 소화불량 같은 부작용은 체질의 문제가 아니라 우리 몸이 새로운 연료 공급 방식에 적응하는 과정에서 나타나는 증상일 가능성이 큽니다. 이럴 때 중요한 것은 서두르지 않고 천천히 몸이 변화를 받아들이도록 시간을 주는 것입니다. 그러니 빠른 결과를 얻고 싶은 욕심에 모든 걸 하루아침에 다 바꾸지 말고 천천히 우리 몸이 적응할 시간을 주세요. 여러 영상에서 언급했지만 제가 하루에 한 끼만 키토식을 해보라고 권유드리는 것도 이런 이유 때문입니다. 그것이 더 효과적이기 때문이 아니라 부작용을 최소화하고 어느 정도 적응한 후에 다음 단계로 나아갈 수 있는 방법이기 때문입니다.
Gotcha. What about when it comes to fat loss? You know, I think what is it? Over a third of the U.S. is now categorized either pre-diabetic or obesity or something like that, right?
Yeah.
What's the statistics?
Yeah, obesity is somewhere around 40%.
40% now.
Yeah.
In the U.S.
Yes.
Do we know what that is globally, or is that just?
I keep looking it up. I keep forgetting.
Okay.
But it's increasing everywhere.
Because I thought it was 33% like 5 years ago in the
Yeah.
US, and now it's 40%.
Yeah.
That's kind of
Yeah.
scary.
It is. It is. And what I talk a lot about, though, is the pre-diabetic. That's the gray area that nobody understands. So we have 10% diabetics. And over a certain age, it's more like 25, 30%. But that's 10% of the entire population is full-blown diabetic.
Wow.
And then they say, I forget the number, I think it's like a third of the population is pre-diabetic. But they base that off of blood sugar only, all right? Mm-hmm. But the only way that you really know where you are on the scale is to do some form of insulin resistance test. And there's some complicated ones that you could do if you want, like oral glucose tolerance tests and all that. But the simplest insulin resistance test is just to measure fasting insulin and see where you are.
Sure.
And this goes back to the model that I use my hands for, where glucose goes up, insulin goes up, and pushes glucose back down. So you could have a person who has a good glucose and a healthy insulin level, but then they eat too much carbs for them, and 10 years later, their insulin is 3, 4, 5 times higher, but their glucose is still normal. Mm-hmm. So that person is not going to make it into the statistics for the insulin resistant or the pre-diabetic. It takes 20 years to get there. So if we actually measure the insulin and we say we're a little bit more sensitive to the gradient, now we're going to see that probably 80% of the population has some degree of insulin resistance.
Gotcha.
Right?
Wow. So how do we eliminate that? Is it through, I mean, how do we burn, is it burning the fat? Is it changing the foods to eliminate that, or what is that?
It's reducing the insulin.
Okay.
Because the insulin is ultimately the fat storing hormone.
How do we reduce the insulin?
By eating less carbohydrates, and because carbohydrates are the foods that stimulate the insulin, and the other thing is to eat fewer meals. Because insulin rises in response to food, so when you don't eat, you're giving the body a chance to drop insulin. But most people, the only time they don't eat is when they're sleeping.
Right. Otherwise, they're eating all
right?
day,
So
snacking.
at best, they get 8 hours of fasting, and then during their waking hours, they just keep topping off the insulin. But if you can just extend that fasting window by a few hours, you've already made a huge difference. So if you go, instead of eating your last meal at 11 and your first meal at 7, what if you just skip that evening meal? What if you don't eat after dinner at 6 o'clock? Now you've just extended that period where insulin could drop by 5 hours. More than 50% increase, right? So those are some simple tools, and that's why intermittent fasting is so popular.
Yes.
And I would say it's even more powerful than low carb, because fasting is zero carb.
Now, like most diets and trends we see out there in the health world, you know, all these different names of diets, is intermittent fasting going to be another fad for a decade and then go away? Or do you think this is something that people will actually use because there's so much pain with, you know, pre-diabetes and fat storage?
I think when people learn to eat real food, then intermittent fasting almost becomes natural. It becomes so easy. It's such a no-brainer. And everyone who tries it, who gets to the point where they might eat twice a day, they might have lunch and dinner, and then there's no temptation, there's no urgency to go back because it feels so normal. And if we look again, we go back to our ancestors, 250,000 years, how did they eat? Well, they didn't wake up to a stocked fridge. They might have had some nuts or a little bit of meat left over from the day, but I don't believe that they would eat it because they had a healthy metabolism. They were metabolically flexible. So they woke up and they went out to catch something before they ate again. So I think it's very logical to assume that we ate once or twice a day for almost all of human history.
Until like 100 years ago or something.
Correct.
Wow.
And even less than that, and that's why we've had this explosion.
에크버그 박사의 말대로 저탄수화물 식단을 하는 사람들에게는 하루에 2끼나 1끼만 먹는 것이 너무나도 자연스럽게 느껴집니다. 하지만 일반적인 고탄수화물 위주의 식단을 하는 분들에게는 이 방식이 어떻게 가능한 것인지 잘 상상이 되지 않을 수 있습니다. 평소에 먹던 시간보다 식사 시간이 1-2시간만 늦어져도 극심한 배고픔이 찾아오는데 어떻게 끼니를 건너뛸 수 있냐고요. 저 역시도 그랬습니다. 지금은 하루에 최소 12시간에서 16시간의 공복을 유지하는데 그것이 전혀 어렵게 느껴지지 않습니다. 하지만 저는 몇 년 전까지만 해도 삼시세끼를 꼬박꼬박 챙겨 먹었었는데요. 식사 사이에도 허기가 자주 찾아왔고 식사 시간이 조금이라도 늦어지면 좀처럼 견디지 못하고 신경이 날카로워졌었습니다. 소위 먹고 뒤돌아서면 배고프다고 하는 그런 사람이었죠. 그리고 그 이유는 제가 대사적으로 건강하고 소화력이 뛰어나서 그런 거라고 착각했었습니다. 하지만 제가 느꼈던 배고픔은 일종의 혈당 스파이크 현상이었다는 걸 한참 뒤에서야 알게 되었습니다. 탄수화물 위주의 식사를 하면 혈당이 빠르게 오르내리게 되는데요. 혈당이 급격하게 떨어질 때 강한 공복감을 느끼게 됩니다. 이는 실제로 몸에 에너지가 부족해서가 아니라 혈당이 급격히 변동하면서 느껴지는 허기입니다. 따라서 고탄수화물 식단을 하면서 간헐적 단식을 하는 것은 거의 불가능에 가까운 일입니다. 반면 저탄수화물 식단을 하면 배고픔에 대한 인식에 큰 변화가 생깁니다. 우리 몸은 주 에너지원으로 탄수화물이 아닌 지방을 사용하게 되고 이 과정에서 혈당과 인슐린 수치가 안정적으로 유지됩니다. 지방 대사를 통해 생성되는 케톤체는 뇌와 신체의 안정적인 에너지원 역할을 하며 공복 상태에서도 에너지가 충분히 공급됩니다. 또한 렙틴과 그렐린 같은 식욕 관련 호르몬들이 조절되면서 배고픔이 줄어드는 효과가 나타납니다. 따라서 저탄수화물 식단을 하면 배고픔을 느끼는 빈도와 강도가 크게 감소하고 간헐적 단식이 배고픔을 꾹꾹 참는 고행이 아니라 자연스러운 생활 패턴으로 자리 잡게 됩니다.
Even through the 1950s and 60s and even into the 70s, people ate mostly 3 meals. And then is when they told us to eat low fat. That's when the low fat craze came. And what do you do?
High carb.
Exactly. When you can't eat the fats, now you got to eat something else. And those carbs are very transient, right? They raise the blood sugar and your body has to get it out of there. And as soon as blood sugar drops, now you're hungry again. So this is part of what got us on this roller coaster.
When did diabetes become a thing in the US? Like, when did it start to becoming a real problem?
Originally, when they talked about diabetes, it was type 1 diabetes, right? Because that's a failure of the pancreas to produce insulin. And those people used to die. There was no treatment, there was no cure. If they ate extremely low carb, they could live a little longer. But basically, type 1 diabetes is starvation in the midst of plenty. That your blood sugar is 700, but you can't use it because you don't have insulin. So insulin's not a bad thing. But type 2 was unheard of. Even at the
Really?
even in the 1800s, they might have known what it was, but it was so rare that it wasn't like a concept or anything. And it really wasn't until the 1970s that it became like a problem.
The 70s.
Yeah.
So we're talking 50 years ago.
Yeah.
Type 2 diabetes
Yeah.
wasn't a thing before then.
They knew what it was, and they had some insulin to treat it, but it was such a small percentage that it was, I wouldn't say it didn't exist, but I mean, it was such a small issue compared to what we have today. The stats are, it's exponential.
So do we have a metabolism problem where people aren't able to metabolize as efficiently what they're bringing into their body and their system, and that's why the weight, the belly fat, the obesity is happening? Or is it an insulin problem, or is it a lack of movement problem?
They all tie together.
Gotcha.
They all tie together, and the sad part is that